Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We certainly appreciate it. As you can see, today we're going to be discussing part 3 of our series that we've subtitled The Passport to Heaven. We're going to be looking very closely into 1843 and the first portion of 1844. By the end of August of 1843, Joseph had moved into the mansion house. And by mid-September, the home was opened as a hotel for visiting guests. Joseph now had this beautiful home where guests could be given proper courtesies. The summer of 1843 seemed to be kind of the calm before the storm. It was in the fall that friends turned to foes and started their unrelenting attacks on Joseph. An anti-Mormon political party was formed by Thomas Sharp in Warsaw. John C. Bennett, ex-mayor of Nauvoo, had already shown his colors, as we discussed in our last podcast. And now it was Sidney Rigdon's turn. Sidney was postmaster of Nauvoo for a brief period of time. And due to jealousy of the prophet, he did everything he could to secretly find reasons and ways to hurt him. He opened up nearly all of Joseph's mail before it was delivered in an effort to gain information that he might use against him. At a conference of the church held on Sunday, August 13th, 1843, the prophet accused Sidney of being in covenant to betray him to the Missourians. Well, Sidney was then disfellowshipped. However, on October 8th, at a conference of the church, Sidney defended his actions, and with an eloquent speech, he was permitted to retain his station as a counselor in the first presidency. President Joseph Smith then arose and said, "I have thrown him off my shoulders, and you have again put him back on me. You may carry him, but I will not." Well, it seems by now that Joseph had lost all confidence in his first counselor. During the fall and winter of 1843, hundreds upon hundreds of saints arrived from the British Isles and other missions of the church. On September the 4th, Joseph and his family were well entertained. Joseph took that opportunity to take a little time off, and his family attended a visiting circus. It was also in September that Joseph started bringing others, including women, into his elite endowment group. On September 28, 1843, Joseph, by common consent and unanimous vote, was chosen president of this endowment quorum, and received his second anointing, and was ordained to the highest and holiest order of the priesthood, that of being a king and a priest. The group of special friends became known as the Holy Anointed Quorum. And over the next 9 months, Joseph administered the sacred temple ordinances to nearly 70 persons. The members of the Holy Anointed Quorum viewed expulsion from their ranks with grave seriousness. In December of 1845, Heber C. Kimball said, "Originally, Joseph admitted 9 persons into the Holy Order. 5 are now living, 2 are dead, and 2, William Law and William Marks, are worse than dead." Well, the Holy Quorum met semi-weekly, and they were taught the order of prayer, and became an ecclesiastical body where revelations could be tested and talked about. The nucleus of this group was, obviously, the 12 apostles. Joseph gave to them their first and second anointings and committed the keys of the kingdom and every gift and power that Joseph ever received. Joseph was now preparing these brethren for the future. The fall of 1843 was filled with a variety of unsavory events. Joseph did, however, enjoy one particular October evening when a phrenologist came into town and asked to examine the bumps on Joseph's head. And he consented and said, and I quote, "It was a very pleasant experience." Well, these pleasantries are going to end real quick, because on November 5th, after dining, Joseph was taken suddenly very, very sick. He went to the door and vomited profusely, dislocating his jaw and drawing blood. Every indication was that Joseph Smith had been poisoned. On November the 19th, 1843, the Missourian mobs became more bolder and more daring. They actually crossed the Mississippi River and kidnapped Philandry Avery, who was living near Warsaw. And then on December 2nd, the same group of Missourians kidnapped Daniel Avery, Philander's father. Well, Philander made his escape on December the 14th, and on Christmas Day, Daniel was liberated through pressure applied by the church leaders to the governor to prosecute those that were responsible for these two kidnappings. On Monday, December 25th, 1843, Christmas, Joseph and Hiram were awakened at 1 o'clock in the morning by a group of caroling saints. Well, they blessed them and said that they thought a cohort of angels had come to visit them. And that afternoon, Joseph sat down with about 50 couples to have Christmas dinner. The evening was spent in music and dancing. Now, while the festivities were proceeding, a man came to the door. His hair was long and scraggly and falling over his shoulders, and he appeared to be drunk. Joseph requested the captain of the police to put him out of doors. A scuffle then ensued, and Joseph had an opportunity to look the man full into the face, when, to his great surprise and joy, he discovered that it was his tired and cruelly persecuted friend, Orrin Porter Rockwell. Orrin had just arrived from nearly a year's imprisonment without conviction in Missouri. He had been arrested in St. Louis for the attempted murder of Lilburn Boggs. He was freed with the help of Alexander Donovan after spending many months in the very same Liberty Jail in Clay County, Missouri, that Joseph was imprisoned in. Now, of significant importance to Joseph was information that Orrin obtained in Independence while in jail. It seems the Missourians felt that they could overthrow Mormonism and capture Joseph with the aid of a few of his most confidential friends. Well, with this knowledge, Joseph swore 40 police officers into the police force of Nauvoo. Captain Jonathan Dunham was in command. Second in command was Charles C. Rich, followed by Hosea Stout and Shadrach Roundy. These men were addressed by both Joseph and Hiram, and the emphasis being on your integrity as police officers and do not accept bribes. Nauvoo had become a haven for characters of ill repute. It seems that there were many corrupt apostates as well. Joseph feared he might be betrayed, kidnapped, and perhaps even taken to Missouri. He told the officers that he had charged. He said, "I am exposed to far greater dangers from traitors amongst ourselves than from enemies without. I have had pretended friends betray me. All the enemies upon the face of the earth may roar and exert all their power to bring about my death, but they can accomplish nothing unless some who are among us and have enjoyed our society, have been with us in our councils and participated in our confidences, and taken us by the hand and called us brothers, and saluted us with a kiss, then join our enemies. We have a Judas in our midst." Now, some took offense to what Joseph had said. Visibly upset was William Law, Joseph's second counselor in the first presidency. He felt the police suspected he was the traitor spoken of and felt he was being unduly harassed by them. A special city council meeting was called on January 2nd, 1844, to address his complaint. It was then concluded that perhaps it was a misunderstanding, and William Law then shook hands with Joseph and said, and I quote, "I will stand by you to the death," close quote. He then called the whole council and police officers to witness this declaration. Well, suffice it to say that Mr. Law was nothing more than a traitor in sheepskin. 3 days later, William Marks filed a similar complaint against the police for harassment. He felt that they had selected him as the Judas. He protested that the police had built a fire out in front of his home to intimidate him, not just to keep warm by. Another city council was held to determine the source of these rumors. Wilson Law testified this time, as did Francis M. Higbee. Francis was rebuked by Joseph during the hearing for spreading rumors. Well, at the conclusion of this hearing, General Wilson Law, like his brother William Law 3 days earlier, said, and I quote, "I am Joseph's friend. He has no better friend in the world, and I am ready to lay down my life for him." Well, another wolf in sheepskin. As a result of the rebuke that Francis was given, he breathed out many warnings against the prophet. And on January 16th, Francis M. Higbee was brought up on a complaint filed by Orson Pratt for slander against the prophet. Well, Joseph forgave him, and Francis said, and I quote, "I will be his friend forever and his right-hand man." Well, these three men, William and Wilson Law, William and Wilson Law, and Francis Higbee personified Judas literally in every way, even to the betrayal by a kiss. Obviously, they had forgotten the scripture found in 2 Nephi 9:34. Woe unto the liars, for they shall be thrust down to hell. On January the 18th, the prophet enjoyed a brief break from his numerous visits to court. He held a cotillion party at the Nauvoo Mansion House and later took a sleigh ride with Emma. In mid-January, Joseph relinquished his role as host of the Nauvoo Mansion and rented it to Ebenezer Robinson for $1,000 a year and boarding for the Smith family. It continued to be used as a boarding house. By the first of the year, anti-Mormon sentiment in nearby towns of Carthage, Warsaw, and Green Plains intensified. It seems Nauvoo was slowly being strangled by mobocracy. At a meeting of the Quorum of the 12 on January 29, 1844, there was a discussion had involving the upcoming national elections. The two primary candidates were President Martin Van Buren, who earlier had told Joseph when he was in Washington presenting his complaints, he said, "Your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you." And then there's Henry Clay, who had told the saints, "You better go to Oregon for redress." Well, it was proposed by Willard Richards and voted unanimously that the saints would have an independent electoral ticket and that Joseph Smith would be the candidate for president. Joseph dictated a pamphlet entitled Views on the Powers and Policies of the Government of the United States. 1,500 pamphlets were printed for distribution. The 12 were then asked to travel to the eastern cities and campaign for the prophet as president. Joseph's platform would include many of the following items. The Constitution was an inspired document. Slavery was to be abolished, and every slaveholder was to receive a fair price for his slaves by Congress. Prisons were to be turned into places where criminals could be taught useful trades and reformed. He would lower taxes and establish a national bank. He felt Congress was too large and needed to be cut by 2/3, and that Oregon, Texas, and Mexico should be part of the United States. He also felt that the president should be allowed to send troops into any part of the nation to put down uprisings. Well, these were new and creative ideas that would eventually thrust Joseph into the arena of a serious contender. Now, February saw continued temple building. One afternoon, William Weeks, the temple architect, came in to talk to Joseph for instruction. Joseph gave him instruction in relation to the circular windows that were to be lighted for the temple interior. Brother Weeks told Joseph that they were a violation of every known rule of architecture. The building was too low for round windows. Joseph then told Brother Weeks, quote, "I wish you to carry out my designs. I have seen in vision the splendid appearance of that temple illuminated and will have it built according to the pattern shown me." And so they were. On February 20th, with the compounding problem surrounding Nauvoo, Joseph instructed the 12 to send a delegation to California and Oregon to hunt for a good location to relocate the saints after the temple was built. He was looking for about 25 people to take the journey. He said, "I want a place where the devil cannot dig us out." So the 25 were found, and Joseph then prophesied that, quote, "within 5 years we should be out of the power of our old enemies." The 1st of March, 1844, saw the prophet ask for the work on the Nauvoo house to stop until we could complete the temple. He said, "We need the temple more than anything else." Well, it seems at this particular time that Joseph became anxious about 3 things. First, the completion of the temple. Second, proper temple records to be kept. And third, the training of the Quorum of 12 Apostles. At a meeting of the 12, Joseph told them, quote, "Some important scene is near to take place. Perhaps I will be killed. This is why I want to give to you all the keys and powers that I hold. Then I can go with all pleasure and satisfaction, knowing that my work is done." Well, he began to pace the floor, and rolling down the collar of his coat, he said, "I roll the burden and responsibility of leading this church off on your shoulders. Now round up your shoulders and stand under it like men, for the Lord is going to let me rest for a while." Joseph continued to make preparation for his presidential candidacy. He nominated James Arlington Bennett of Long Island as a candidate for vice president. However, Joseph learned later that James Bennett was a native of Ireland and not a constitutionally eligible individual for vice president. It was then thought perhaps to ask Colonel Solomon Copeland of Paris, Tennessee, to run for vice president. Well, in the midst of his presidential preparation, Joseph continued to care for the mundane problems of Nauvoo. In a speech delivered on March 4th, Hiram Kimball was censured for allowing boats to dock in Nauvoo without paying wharfage. It seems Hiram Kimball had a little boat dock out to the side of his home. He also spoke of another man, a guy named Charles Foster, who had been writing the New York Tribune and spreading false lies about the construction cost of the temple. He continued saying, "Our difficulties and persecutions have always arisen from men right in our midst." On March 9, 1844, King Follett died. He died when a rope broke, dropping a load of rocks on his head as he was walling up a well. King Follett was one of the original members of the church, having joined the church in 1831. He stood in jail with Parley P. Pratt for many months in Missouri. Joseph called him our worthy brother. Joseph loved King Follett. The next day, on Sunday, March the 10th, Joseph preached. He spoke on the spirit of Elijah and not being able to receive exaltation without redeeming our dead. He also met the 12 apostles and organized a clandestine group that he called the Council of 50. This group was a parapolitical organization that was given the responsibilities of overseeing the settlement of Texas, which was a platform item for Joseph's presidential candidacy. They were also to be the governing body of the municipal department of the kingdom of God on earth. Joseph spent the next few weeks establishing the parameters for this particular group. Of the 46 members of the Council of 50, 26 were also members of the Holy Anointed Quorum. The 12 apostles were the only priesthood quorum that was completely represented in both the Holy Anointed Quorum and the Council of 50. Joseph was again trying to put the 12 in a position where they would be administering to both the church and the kingdom of God on earth. Well, about this time, Joseph received some correspondence from his good friend Lyman White. Lyman White was in the Southwest preaching to the Indians and suggested that perhaps the church migrate to Texas as its new home. And you can see from this slide, the church was considering Wisconsin, Texas, Oregon, California, a number of different places. By mid-March, Joseph's candidacy for president was picking up steam. It seems that articles written in the Iowa Democrat, the Quincy Herald, and the Illinois Springfield Register, as well as articles that were appearing now in the Eastern press, depicted Joseph as a man of character, and that his opponents ought to be taking him seriously. Well, Joseph continued to study the scriptures and ancient languages, something he loved to do on a regular basis, or at least when he had free time. He studied quite often with Alexander Niebuhr. On Sunday, March 17th, a great westerly wind blew through Nauvoo. It toppled a wall of the 70s hall that was being erected. There was also a severe snowstorm and thick ice. And then a few days later, a hailstorm rocked Nauvoo. Well, the elements were certainly against the saints and the construction of the temple. On March 23rd, the prophet and a few others made a house call on Mrs. Sarah Foster. It seems a report had come to the attention of Joseph that Mr. Foster had stated that Joseph had made a proposition to her. Well, she denied any such conversation had ever taken place with Joseph. It was apparent that Mr. Foster was trying to ruin Joseph's reputation. Dr. Robert Foster was a medical doctor as well as a county magistrate, and he joined the church in Nauvoo. He caused frequent difficulties for the prophet because of his lewd conduct, and eventually was excommunicated from the church in April of 1844. His brother Charles was also instrumental in regular persecutions of the prophet. Charles, however, was not a member of the church. Finally, on Sunday the 24th, Joseph's wrath was kindled enough that he went public with the names of those who had hatched the conspiracy to take his life and destroy the church. Chauncey L. Higby, Dr. Robert Foster, Joseph H. Jackson, William and Wilson Law. These were the men telling others that Joseph had killed those who did not agree with him in Missouri, and that he needed to be removed permanently. This plot was discovered by two young boys, Dennison L. Harris and Robert Scott. The two 17-year-olds were invited to attend a secret meeting of the conspirators at the home of William Law. Well, they went to Dennison's father, Emer Harris, who was brother of Martin Harris, as to whether they should attend this meeting or not. He told the boys they ought to lay the matter before the feet of the prophet. So they went to Joseph and talked to him. And Joseph told the boys to go, but do not take any oaths. The meeting was attended by over 200 people. The two boys remained quiet. William Law spent time explaining why Joseph was a fallen prophet. As the meeting progressed, each member was requested to take an oath, and the boys refused, and they attempted to leave. Well, they were detained and threatened with death. The boys still refused to accept the oaths. They were then taken to the cellar to be executed. As the boys were about to be executed, there rose a little bit of a concern over their absence in the community should they kill them. The boys were then threatened with death and sent home. The boys went immediately to the prophet and told him the entire story. The courage and heroism of these two boys brought tears to the eyes of the prophet. At the core of this destructive plot was none other than William Law, a Canadian convert who migrated to Nauvoo. He became associated with Dr. Robert Foster, who was a real estate promoter and financier. Law's sharpness and skill were soon brought to the attention of Joseph, who thought he could help build the city. He soon became an officer serving in the Nauvoo Legion. Unfortunately, Law measured everything, including the church, by a business standard. He began to criticize some of Joseph's decisions and policies. He was against the building of the Nauvoo house and the temple. And the rift with Joseph became acute when Joseph commenced to instruct his inner circle in the doctrine of plural wives. Well, although William himself was guilty of adultery, he saw this revelation as a serious financial setback. If this doctrine ever surfaced in Nauvoo, he felt the city would be doomed, and his opportunity to continue to milk it of its wealth would be gone. William Law was suspected by the prophet for many months as the traitor within. Once William Law realized that the prophet had concrete evidence to link him to the conspiracy, he moved further underground and associated himself with other conspirators, such as his wife, Jane, his brother Wilson, Chauncey Higby, the criminal Joseph H. Jackson, whom he had offered $500 to kill the prophet, and Mr. and Mrs. Robert Foster, who immediately supported him in his satanic plans. In a conversation with George A. Smith, Joseph pointed one evening to William Law and said, "There is the meanest man in the whole town. All the sorrow I ever had in my family or in this city arose through the influence of William Law." John Taylor declared that William Law is one of the virest psychopaths and hypocrites that ever disgraced the footstool of God. The prophet said, "We are sorry to find that our lawyers and magistrates should be taking the lead as gamblers and disorderly persons and be numbered among the lawbreakers." Now, this reference was to the Higbys and Fosters, who earlier in April were arrested for assault, abusive language, threats, and gambling. In March of 1842, Nauvoo had been given permission earlier, if you remember from our prior podcast, to build a Masonic lodge. Well, on April 5th, 1844, it was completed and dedicated. About 550 members of the Masonic fraternity attended. The dedication was performed by the worshipful master, Hiram Smith. On April 5th, there was a general conference of the church. It lasted 5 days. The first 2 sessions were occupied by Sidney Rigdon as he presented the history of the church. On the 7th, Hiram spoke about the need to complete the temple. The afternoon session, Joseph would speak to over 20,000 saints. The weather was dreary. It was windy, and it was raining. The storm, however, ceased during the conference at the Grove. It continued to rain on all sides of the Grove, yet it was calm in the Grove when Joseph spoke. Joseph took the opportunity to talk of King Follot's death. Joseph had been ill and unable to speak at his funeral. He began by addressing the character of God. During his discussion, he said, God himself was once as we are now, and is an exalted man and sits enthroned in yonder heaven. Well, this doctrine was aphorized by Lorenzo Snow when he said, as man now is, God once was, and as God now is, man may become. Joseph also taught that the German version of the Bible was the most accurate and correct. He spoke of the counsel of gods and the creation of the earth. He addressed the immortal intelligence of man. He taught of the relationship between man and God, and that man's greatest responsibility was to seek for the salvation of the dead. He concluded his sermon with a discussion on the unpardonable sin and the necessity of seeking forgiveness of sins. It was also during this conference that Joseph made the infamous statement that you don't know me, you never will. I don't blame you for not believing my history, and had I not experienced it, I could not believe it myself. On April the 8th, Joseph continued his sermon by stating that the whole of the North and South America is Zion. Quote, henceforth, whenever the elders of Israel shall build up churches and branches unto the Lord, throughout the states they shall be a stake of Zion. On April 9th, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball spoke. This was a grand and glorious conference of illuminating messages. In particular, the King Follett Discourses, one of the most enlightening and instructional orations ever given by the prophet to the saints. You see, we've come a long way since 1830 with 8 members, now over 17 million. Well, shortly after this spiritual high, the prophet had to deal with some temporal lows. On April 18th, William Law, Wilson Law, Jane Law, and Robert Foster were formally excommunicated from the church for unchristian conduct, and to make matters worse, on the last day of April, saw Nauvoo hit by a torrential rain that continued for many, many days. The rains and hail caused considerable damage to the city. In fact, the Mississippi River was higher than ever known by its oldest inhabitants. It appeared the elements, as well as the Laws, Higbees, and Fosters, were conspiring against the saints. Now, on April 26, violence broke out involving the Fosters, Chauncey Higbee, and the prophet. In the arrest of a man named Augustine Spencer, who had assaulted his brother Orson, the Fosters and Higbees, who were nearby, were asked to assist the officer with the arrest. But instead of helping, they attempted to interfere with the arrest. The 3 were ordered arrested by Joseph for refusing to discharge their duty. Charles Foster then pulled a gun on Joseph and threatened to shoot him. Joseph ordered him arrested, and a struggle ensued in which Charles and Robert Foster and Chauncey Higbee resisted. The trial followed with sworn testimonies that the 3 said that they would consider themselves, quote, the favored of God for the privilege of shooting or ridding the world of such a tyrant as Joseph. The conspirators were all fined $100 each, and had it not been for a very alert sheriff, Robert Foster certainly would have tried to shoot Joseph. On Sunday, April 28th, the conspirators held a meeting. It was held at William Law's home. The purpose was to establish a new church. They would call it the True Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with William Law appointed as the new prophet, and with Austin Cowles and Wilson Law as his counselors. Robert Foster and Francis Higbee were to be 2 of the 12 apostles, and they chose Charles Ivins as bishop. These names ought to sound very, very familiar to you by now. The 1st of May brought a theatrical exhibition to Nauvoo. A number of performances brought a little humor and enjoyment into the furrowed brow of a concerned prophet. The performances were held in the newly built Masonic Hall. On May 6th, Sidney Rigdon was nominated to be the candidate for the vice presidency of the United States, mostly out of default. He was certainly not the prophet's first choice by any means. The St. Louis, Oregon newspaper published an article stating that General Smith had a good chance at the presidency of the United States, and his views were sound. Now, to conclude today's podcast, May 7th, going to go down in the annals of church history as a pretty dark and sinister day. William Law and his co-conspirators turned to a campaign of slander, lies, and gossip. With the arrival that day of a printing press, they announced their plans to begin the publication of a new newspaper in Nauvoo under the very provocative name of the Nauvoo Expositor. I want to thank you for joining me today. It's obvious that our next podcast is going to get into a lot of details involving how the prophet Joseph Smith ends up in Carthage jail. Again, I want to thank you for joining me. We look forward to seeing you next time.